They called her just a nurse. They didn't know her hands had tied off chest tubes under enemy fire in Kandahar 16 hours straight, while command wrote off her entire unit as dead. They didn't know the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining had brushed against shrapnel scars every single day for 8 years. What happened next would prove that assumption catastrophically, devastatingly wrong. Fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical monotone above room 347 at Oak Creek Memorial in Raleigh. Megan O'Brien wiped down the bedside table with practiced precision, her movements economical and exact, the kind of efficiency that came from muscle memory built in places most people would never survive. The antiseptic smell clung to everything, sharp and sterile, mixing with the soft rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor tracking a heartbeat that nobody expected to matter anymore. The mute veteran lay motionless beneath the cotton blanket, his 1,000-yard stare fixed on a water stain on the ceiling tiles. His name was Raymond Voss. According to his chart, he was 43 years old. According to everyone else, he was a hopeless case. The label hung around him like a shroud, invisible but suffocating, offered without diagnosis, without hope, without the faintest attempt at redemption. The staff called him the vegetable in room 347. His own daughter hadn't visited in 11 weeks. Megan adjusted his fur line with her left hand while her right smoothed the wrinkles from his blanket. The needle slid in with no resistance. Her hands knew this work the way a pianist knows a concerto they've played 10,000 times. The scars across her knuckles, pale and precise in a pattern that didn't match any civilian accident, caught the fluorescent light as she worked. She'd earned those scars in 2016, year 3 of a classified operation she was never supposed to speak about again. She repositioned his pillow, the one covered in a faded blue hospital case that had been there so long the fabric had taken on the shape of his head. Megan moved around the room like water around stone, present, necessary, entirely expected. Nobody watched her move. Nobody watched her work. This was the advantage of being invisible. This was the only armor she had left. Her jacket hung on the chair beside the bed, navy blue, standard issue from the uniform store. She'd bought it 6 months after arriving at Oak Creek Memorial. Inside the lining, just above the breast pocket, a single object had been stitched with careful thread. A unit patch. Faded from 16 years of wear, from dust that came from places that no longer existed on official maps, from the weight of hands that had held it through 3 wars and 1 catastrophic loss. The patch brushed against her ribs each time she moved, a heartbeat that only she could feel. A reminder of who she had been. A warning about who she could never be again. The veteran's chest tube, a 36 French silicone catheter running from his left pleural space to a collection bottle, needed repositioning. Megan gathered fresh gauze and tape from the supply cart, moving with the fluid precision of someone who had done this exact procedure hundreds of times, maybe thousands. Her hands worked while her mind stayed calm. She began to tie off the securing knot with a specific technique, her fingers looping the tape in a particular sequence that was neither standard hospital protocol nor what any civilian nursing school would teach. It was a Kandahar field technique. Field medicine developed in a trauma surgery tent where supply chains had collapsed, where you had to work with what you had and make it hold under conditions that would break most people. Her hands knew this not the way they knew breathing. Dr. Marcus Ramos appeared in the doorway, a former combat medic who'd served 13 years before the shoulder wound ended his operational career. He'd taken a medical degree after his discharge and now worked as an attending at Oak Creek Memorial, one of the few people in the hospital who still carried the weight of that other world inside his chest. He watched Megan tie off the chest tube. He watched her hands move. He watched the technique unfold. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze its mechanical rhythm. Ramos stepped closer. His eyes tracked the pattern of her fingers. She finished the knot, checked the tension, secured the gauze with 3 pieces of tape placed in a precise triangle. Professional. Correct. Unmistakably specific. Where does a civilian nurse learn to tie off like that? Ramos's voice was soft, conversational, the kind of voice that carried weight precisely because it never raised. That's not in any textbook I've read. That's field medicine. That's Kandahar work. Megan didn't pause. She didn't flinch. Her hands continued their work, checking the flow rate, making a small notation on the chart. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and deferential, the voice she wore in public like a borrowed coat. YouTube has a lot of tutorials these days, Dr. Ramos. You can learn almost anything if you look hard enough. She set the chart down. Her jacket sat draped across the chair beside the bed, and for just a moment, the movement of her arm shifted the fabric. The edge of the unit patch became visible, faded blue and gold, the colors muted from years of being pressed against skin and hidden beneath layers of civilian life. Then she caught it and pulled the jacket back into position, covering the patch with the same economical movement she'd used to adjust a patient's blanket. Ramos didn't ask any more questions. But his eyes carried something different now, recognition, maybe. Suspicion, definitely. The kind of look that came from seeing something familiar in someone who was supposed to be ordinary. The veteran's eyes had shifted slightly. They'd moved from the water stain on the ceiling to Megan's face. No sound came from his mouth. His jaw remained locked in whatever private silence had claimed him weeks ago. But something in his gaze had changed. Something that looked almost like awareness flickered there, then retreated back into the depths. Megan pulled the blanket up to his shoulders. She checked the monitors one final time, cardiac rhythm steady, blood pressure stable, oxygen saturation 94% on 2 liters nasal cannula. All the vital signs that mark the difference between life and the slow process of being forgotten. She recorded everything in her neat handwriting, the kind of documentation that revealed nothing but competence. She was preparing the evening medications when Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway. His shoes clicked against the tile, expensive leather that hadn't come from the hospital gift shop, shoes that announced presence before the man ever opened his mouth. He carried a tablet under his arm and wore the expression of someone who had already decided what he would find before he looked. Sterling was 51 years old, the chief of internal medicine at Oak Creek Memorial for the past 8 years. His family had money that went back 3 generations, old Raleigh wealth that financed country club memberships and a house in the historic district. He'd graduated from Duke Medical School with a 3.1 GPA, not exceptional at all, but his network had carried him from there to here. He'd learned early that competence was less important than perception, that confidence could mask incompetence if you spoke loudly enough about your limitations being everyone else's fault. "Ms. O'Brien," he said, his voice carrying the particular condescension reserved for people he'd already decided were beneath him. "A moment in the hallway, please. These residents need to observe." Megan finished recording the vital signs. She set the chart down gently and followed him into the corridor, where the fluorescent light seemed even brighter somehow, even more harsh. 2 residents trailed behind Sterling like remoras following a shark, young, ambitious, still convinced that proximity to power was the same thing as understanding it. Sterling gestured toward the nurse's station, where 3 call lights blinked in the hallway. 3 patients. Unanswered. Waiting. "Notice," he said, his voice loud enough that the residents leaned in, "how our colleague here has spent the last 20 minutes on a single patient. A patient, I might add, who will never contribute meaningfully to our institution again. A patient with no family support, no chance of recovery, and no reason to consume hospital resources that other patients require." The residents exchanged glances. One of them, a woman named Chen who'd impressed Sterling in the OR, nodded as if she'd been given a revelation about the fundamental nature of medical practice. Megan stood with her hands at her sides, her jaw level, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond Sterling's left shoulder. The technique worked. It always worked. If you didn't engage, if you didn't defend, if you didn't react, you became the invisible thing they wanted you to be. Just a nurse. Just someone who'd made a choice about where her attention went. "Your obsession with this patient violates care distribution protocols," Sterling continued, his voice dropping now, more intimate, more dangerous. "Other patients are being neglected while you play therapist to a vegetable. We're here to provide medicine, not compassion to the irredeemable." The word hung in the air between them. Irredeemable. Megan felt something cold settle in her chest, not fear, because fear was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. Something colder than fear. Something like recognition. She'd heard this tone before. She'd heard this judgment before. And she'd learned long ago that the people who delivered it loudest were the ones who'd never actually seen what humans were capable of enduring. She didn't respond. She simply waited, the way she'd been trained to wait, the way she'd survived by waiting. The patch against her rib seemed heavier suddenly, the weight of it pressing against her scars, a constant reminder of exactly who she was and what she'd been made to do. Sterling turned back to his residence. "Document this," he said. "Document her time management, her priorities, her deviation from standard protocols. We may need it for performance reviews." He walked away, his expensive shoes clicking against tile. The residents followed. One of them glanced back at Megan with something like pity, as if she didn't already know exactly what was coming. Megan stood in the hallway for 3 seconds. Then she returned to room 347, where the mute veteran lay unchanged, where the monitors beeped their steady rhythm, where the unit patch pressed against her scars like a hand she'd thought she'd never feel again. "It's going to be a long shift," she said quietly, speaking to no one but needing to hear her own voice anyway. "Just keep breathing." She wasn't sure if she was talking to him or to herself. Evening rounds at Oak Creek Memorial moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, until Dr. Sterling stopped in the hallway outside room 347 and positioned himself like a prosecutor arranging his courtroom. Megan was adjusting Colonel Voss's verdrip when she heard the voice, that particular cadence that meant an audience was about to be made of her. 2 residents flanked Sterling, their notebooks already open, positioned not by accident but by design. She knew the choreography of humiliation. She'd seen it before in classrooms and briefing rooms, the careful staging of public dismantling. "Ms. O'Brien." Sterling's voice carried down the corridor with the weight of someone accustomed to being heard. 6 other nurses within earshot suddenly became very interested in their charts. "Your obsession with this patient violates care distribution protocols. Other patients are being neglected while you play therapist to a vegetable." The word hung in the air like contamination. Megan's hand stilled on the fall line. She took one measured breath through her nose, the kind that came from years of holding still while the world tried to break you. Her jaw tightened, a single muscle in her cheek flickering once. She turned to face Sterling directly, her eyes level with his, and when she spoke her voice came out steady as a surgical laser. "Colonel Voss deserves the same standard of care as every patient on this unit." "Colonel." Sterling smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had already won. "Colonel Voss is a mute shell who contributes nothing to his own recovery. Your emotional attachment is unprofessional and frankly, concerning. I'm recommending a peer review of your clinical judgment." One tear escaped her left eye, not from fear, but from the pressure of restraint, the kind that comes from swallowing rage for so long it crystallizes into something harder than diamond. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her hand moving with mechanical precision, and in that moment something shifted in her posture. The residents exchanged glances. Even Sterling's smile faltered slightly. "Dismissing him as broken doesn't make him less worthy of care," Megan said quietly. "It makes us less worthy of wearing scrubs." The silence that followed was so thick you could have operated in it. Sterling's face flushed, not anger exactly, but the recognition that he had just been outmaneuvered by someone he'd categorized as beneath him. He recovered quickly, the way powerful men do, leaning back on his authority like a shield. "Return to your station, Ms. O'Brien. We're done here." He walked away without waiting for acknowledgement, the residents trailing behind him like remoras following a shark. The other nurses pretended they hadn't heard anything, their eyes locked on their screens, but the corridor had changed. Something had shifted in the air pressure. Megan waited until Sterling was out of sight, then returned to Colonel Voss's bedside and continued her work without trembling, without hesitation, her movements precise as they had always been. The next day arrived grey and thin, the kind of morning where the fluorescent lights at Oak Creek seemed to drain rather than illuminate. Megan entered the break room at 3 o'clock with her lunch, a thermos of black coffee and a sandwich she'd prepared at home because she knew, somehow, that today the break room would feel different. It did. For nurses were clustered by the coffee maker, and the conversation stopped the moment she walked in. Not gradually. Not the natural pause of interrupted speech. Complete cessation, like someone had cut the audio. Two of them she had trained personally, walking them through their first fours, teaching them the hand positions that made insertion smooth as water. One was Sarah Chen, who had cried in Megan's office when her mother had been admitted to ICU 3 months ago. Megan had stayed 2 hours past shift end that day, sitting beside her, not saying much, just being present with the weight of it. Now Sarah grabbed her coffee without making eye contact. The others followed like synchronized swimmers. The door swung shut behind them with the finality of a gavel strike. Megan stood alone by the microwave, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly deafening. She set her lunch on the counter and waited, not moving, just standing in the fluorescent glare. 30 seconds. 60. The microwave's empty tray gleamed like a mirror, reflecting nothing but herself. She reached for the handle and pressed the timer, and the mechanical were filled the silence. 2 minutes. That's how long it took to heat her coffee. 2 minutes was how long she stood there while the break room remained empty, while the building settled around her like a living thing turning away. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, a white sheet of paper appeared in a glass case outside the nursing station where schedule announcements and policy updates were posted. The case locked with a keycard, accessible only to management. The paper was centered, professional, unsigned at the bottom, only Dr. Sterling's title printed in bold, Department Director. Incident Report, Formal Right UP. Employee Name, Megan O'Brien, RN. Date of Infraction, Previous Day. Violation, Inappropriate Resource Allocation and Insubordination. Details, Nurse O'Brien has consistently prioritized a single non-responsive patient over unit-wide patient care obligations, resulting in potential neglect of other critical patients. Her refusal to follow standard protocols and her unprofessional manner during supervisory correction constitutes insubordination. This pattern represents a threat to unit efficiency and professional standards. Recommendation, disciplinary meeting scheduled. 3 staff members read it while Megan restocked supplies 10 feet away, her hands moving through the motions of work, checking for gauges, organizing sterile packaging, rotating stock by expiration date. Motion. Purpose. The small rituals that kept the mind occupied while the nervous system registered the smell of antiseptic and something else underneath it, something like betrayal. No one met her eyes as they passed. Sarah Chen took the long way around the unit to avoid walking beside her. By evening, when Megan left her shift, she had heard exactly 0 words from anyone except the charge nurse reporting census numbers. That night, Dr. Ramos found her in room 347, changing Colonel Voss's chest tube dressing with movements that belonged in a field hospital, not a civilian hospital in Raleigh. Her fingers moved with a kind of economy that came from operating under fire, from having to work fast and precise when every second mattered. The tie-off she used was not the standard civilian technique taught in nursing school. It was something older. Something that only appeared in classified military medicine courses that didn't officially exist. Ramos had been a combat medic for 14 years before he went to medical school. He knew the technique the moment he saw it. "That's a Kandahar field technique," he said carefully, standing in the doorway so she would know he was there. "Where'd a civilian nurse learn to tie off like that?" The room seemed to compress. Megan's hands froze for half a second, not panic, but calculation. The kind of pause that happened when multiple options collapsed into a single necessary choice. She finished securing the dressing with 2 more methodical knots, then turned to face him without expression. "YouTube," she said flatly. "There are tutorials for everything now." She walked past him without waiting for follow-up, her stride purposeful but not hurried. Ramos watched her disappear around the corner toward the stairwell, his expression troubled. He'd served with enough operators to recognize the signature, the muscle memory, the way someone moved when they'd been trained to survive. He pulled out his phone but didn't dial. Some things were better left alone. Instead, he made a note of what he'd seen and filed it away in the part of his mind where classified things lived, the compartment that most people forgot existed until something brought it back. But that wasn't the worst part. At 2:07 a.m., 12 hours later, the monitor in room 347 began showing the subtle changes that preceded catastrophe. Megan was doing final rounds when she noticed it, the heart sounds muffled, the jugular veins distended, Colonel Voss's blood pressure dropping like a stone entering water. 78/42 and falling. 60 seconds until his organs would start failing. 2 minutes until cardiac arrest. She hit the code button, but the attending was 7 minutes away, somewhere on the second floor, probably sleeping. Megan moved on her own authority now, pulling the cardiac needle from the crash cart, her hand steady as ballast in a hurricane. The night charge nurse appeared in the doorway. "Wait for Dr. Sterling, he's on call." "He'll be dead in 3 minutes," Megan said, and there was no negotiation in her voice. Just fact. Just information. She positioned the needle below the xiphoid process at a 45-degree angle, aspirating as she advanced. The syringe filled with blood immediately. She was inside the pericardial sac, the fluid that was strangling his heart. She advanced 1 more centimeter, then withdrew, and as she did the pressure released in an almost audible way. The monitor beeped its rhythm back to life. 102. 104. Normal. Alive. 40 seconds. That's all it took. By the time Dr. Sterling arrived, Colonel Voss was breathing normally and his oxygen saturation had climbed back to 96%. Sterling examined the setup, the discarded needle, the drainage bag filling with the fluid that had nearly killed the patient. His expression went cold and crystalline, like ice forming on glass. "Who authorized this procedure?" His voice was quiet now. Dangerous quiet. Megan was washing her hands at the sink, her movements methodical and unhurried. "No one. He was dying. My office. 7 a.m. Sterling left without checking the patient's vitals, without examining the chest tube site, without acknowledging that a man's life had just been saved in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The night charge nurse whispered to Megan as Sterling passed, "You just ended your career." But Megan sat in the dimmed room afterward, watching Colonel Voss's steady heartbeat march across the monitor in its green line of redemption, and she reached inside her jacket, pressing her palm flat against the faded unit patch sewn into the lining. The patch was from Kandahar, worn by soldiers who had seen the worst that war could offer and survived it anyway. She had sewn it there 8 years ago, when she was supposed to disappear and become someone else entirely. Her eyes closed in the darkness of the room, and she whispered to the silence, "I broke cover for a patient." The monitor beeped on. The rain that had started sometime after midnight hammered against the windows like something trying to get in. The monitor shrieked at 2:07 a.m., a sound that cut through the darkness of room 347 like a blade through water. Muffled heart sounds. Distended jugular veins. The numbers told Megan everything, the kind of information that lived in her muscle memory from 16 years ago, from a field hospital in Kandahar where she'd learned to read a body the way other people read printed text. Cardiac tamponade. Blood was compressing Colonel Voss's heart, suffocating it from the inside. He had maybe 4 minutes before his pressure collapsed entirely. The night shift nurse at the desk was on her phone, 200 feet away in the hallway. The resident was sleeping in the call room. The attending physician was 40 minutes out from the hospital, still 10 minutes from even being called. Megan stood at the foot of the bed, processing the numbers, BP dropping like a stone, O2 sat falling from 94 to 88 to 82, heart rate climbing to 142 and still climbing. She didn't wait. She'd stopped waiting for permission 8 years ago when someone in a suit told her to disappear, to become nobody, to forget the sound of rotor blades and the weight of a rifle and the names of the people who died because command wrote them off as dead. Her hands moved to the crash cart. 14-gauge cardiac needle. She didn't think about protocols. She didn't think about Dr. Sterling's voice calling her a maverick, a danger, a woman playing therapist to a vegetable. She thought about pain being information, about the way a body tells you exactly what it needs if you're willing to listen. The needle went in at the 5th intercostal space, between the ribs, into the pericardial sac with the kind of precision that only comes from having done it before when the lights were off and the sound of distant gunfire rattled the canvas walls of a field tent. 40 seconds. That's all it took. The hiss of air escaping. the dark blood draining into the collection syringe like a secret being released. O2 climbing. 82, 88. 94, his pressure stabilizing. His heart rate dropping from the panicked 142 back down to something almost normal, something alive. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm again, and Colonel Voss's body relaxed into the mattress like a fist unclenching. By the time the night charge nurse arrived at the door, mask half on her face, Megan was already disposing of the needle and stepping back from the bed with a kind of composure that made the nurse freeze in place, because the transformation was visible, undeniable. For just 40 seconds, the timid civilian nurse had disappeared, and something else had taken her place. Something with scarred hands and a voice that didn't ask for permission. Megan left the unit at 3 a.m. and drove to the 24-hour diner on Fayetteville Street where the fluorescent lights never dimmed and the coffee tasted like burnt diesel. She sat in a corner booth and ordered oatmeal she didn't eat, staring at her hands under the harsh white light. They weren't shaking. She'd taught them not to shake years ago, back when trembling could get you killed. But they looked different to her now, marked, purposeful, dangerous in a way that the hospital had never seen. By 8 a.m., when she drove back to Oak Creek Memorial, she already knew something had changed. The air felt different. The way the other nurses looked at her was different. A nurse named Chen wouldn't meet her eyes in the break room. Torres, the security guard, suddenly became very interested in his shoes when she passed. At 9:02 a.m., Dr. Sterling made his first call from his office on the second floor, looking down at the parking lot where Megan Subaru sat in the employee section like a small, unremarkable fact he was about to erase. He dialed Patricia Hendricks, a board member who'd gone to medical school with him at Duke, someone who understood the importance of institutional control and the danger of loose cannons operating without oversight. His voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of a man who'd been doing this kind of thing for 23 years, since he was a resident with eyes like a predator assessing wounded prey. Pat, I need to bring something sensitive to your attention. One of our nurses, Megan O'Brien, on the cardiac unit, performed an unauthorized procedure last night on a critical patient without waiting for the attending. Cardiac intervention. Dangerous, reckless behavior that could have killed the patient instead of helped him. We need to investigate her credentials before this becomes a liability issue for the hospital. I'm concerned about her judgment, her training history. There are gaps in her employment record that don't add up. I'd like to bring in an outside investigator. The second call came at 9:15 a.m., this time to nursing school director Margaret Chen at UNC Chapel Hill, where Megan had graduated top of her class in 2010. Sterling's voice took on a different tone, concerned, collegial, the voice of one administrator protecting another institution. I'm hoping you can clarify some things about one of your graduates. Megan O'Brien, class of 2010. We're doing a routine credential review, and I noticed some unusual gaps in her employment history between 2012 and 2016. For years. She claims to have been working, but there's nothing in any of our databases. No hospital records, no clinical positions listed, no references we can verify. Did she ever mention any unusual employment situations to you? Consulting work? Government positions? Anything that might explain the gaps? Margaret Chen's voice crackled back across the line, professional but uncertain. I don't recall anything unusual about Megan's trajectory. She was one of our best students. Very focused, very quiet. Why are you asking? Just routine verification, Sterling said, and hung up before she could ask more questions. By 9:53 a.m. he'd already made the third call, this one to an outside credentials investigator named Morton who specialized in license audits and background reviews, the kind of investigator hospitals brought in when they wanted to build a case against someone without triggering any internal alarms. I need a full audit on one of our nurses, Sterling said, pulling up Megan's employee file on his screen. Megan O'Brien, RN, license number 4472891, graduated 2010. Focus on any breaks in employment, any unexplained gaps, any irregularities in her licensure record. I'm particularly interested in the period between 2012 and 2016. She claims to have been working, but nothing shows up on our standard verification systems. I want to know where she was, what she was doing, and why her employment history doesn't add up. Standard audit usually takes 2 weeks, Morton said. Expedite it, Sterling replied. I need preliminary findings by end of business tomorrow. The fourth call went to the hospital legal department at 9:45 a.m., and by that time Sterling had already printed out 17 pages of protocols, medication administration guidelines, physician-led emergency response procedures, and authorized intervention penalties. He was building a file the way an architect builds a house, with careful precision, with the understanding that every brick had to be placed exactly right or the whole structure might collapse. But Sterling had been doing this for 2 decades, and he'd learned that the key was to move fast, to layer the complaints, to make the accusation feel less like a personal vendetta and more like institutional necessity. I need to schedule a termination meeting for today at 2 p.m., he told the HR director, Rebecca Walsh. I'm prepared to document unsafe clinical practice, unauthorized interventions, and insubordination. I have witness statements from the night staff, protocol violations documented, and a full credentials audit in progress. I'd like to have security prepared to escort the employee from the premises at the conclusion of the meeting. This needs to be handled professionally but decisively. But that wasn't the worst part of what was about to happen. At 10:11 a.m., Colonel Voss's daughter Sarah arrived for her daily visit, pushing through the doors to the cardiac unit with the focused intensity of someone who'd been making this trip every single day for the past 3 weeks. She'd watched her father stare at walls, watched him refuse to acknowledge her presence, watched the hospital slowly write him off as hopeless. Her father was 52 years old and the doctors had stopped looking at him like a person who could recover. They looked at him like a piece of furniture that needed occasional dusting. But this morning, something was different. Her father's color was better. His breathing seemed easier. The monitors were beeping a steadier rhythm. She pressed her hand against his shoulder, and for the first time in 23 days, Colonel Raymond Voss turned his head and met her eyes. His mouth opened. His throat worked. And then, in a voice that sounded like gravel and rust, he spoke one word, "Senior." Sarah froze. Her father hadn't spoken since the day he'd been admitted, hadn't acknowledged anyone or anything. The doctor said it was psychological, trauma-based mutism, a symptom of whatever had happened to him in Kandahar that had turned him into a ghost. But he'd spoken now. One word. A name, maybe. A rank. Something that meant something to someone, somewhere. "Senior," she whispered. "Dad, what does that mean? Are you asking for someone?" Colonel Voss's eyes had already closed again, his body settling back into the mattress, his voice spent. But Sarah turned and walked directly to the nurse's station, where Megan was updating charts at 10:27 a.m., completely unaware that her entire life was being dismantled 3 floors above her in a lawyer's office. "That nurse. The one who's been here every time I visit," Sarah said to the charge nurse. "The dark-haired one. Where is she?" Megan looked up from her charting. Their eyes met across the fluorescent-lit stretch of the unit, and in that moment something passed between them, a question and an answer, a door opening and closing at the exact same moment. "Can I help you?" Megan asked, her voice steady as surgical steel. "My father. He said something this morning. A word. Senior. He hasn't talked in almost a month. Whatever you did, whatever changed for him last night, he wants to tell you something. I don't understand what happened, but I see the way everyone's avoiding eye contact with you. I see the way the other nurses look at each other when you walk past. Something happened, and you need to know that my father's better because of it." Megan's jaw tightened. The smallest movement, barely visible. "Your father had a minor cardiac intervention during the night. He's recovering well. That's all I can tell you." But she already knew. By the way the morning shift was treating her, by the sudden absence of normal hallway conversation, by the way even the senior resident seemed to be giving her a wide berth. Something had been set in motion. Dr. Sterling had made his calls. The machinery of institutional power had begun to turn, and she was standing directly in its path. At 11:56 a.m., Megan's badge failed to open the locked medication room. She swiped it 3 times. The electronic lock didn't engage. Torres appeared within 60 seconds, not coincidentally, not randomly, but because he'd been told to watch for exactly this moment. The young security guard's face was a map of discomfort. He knew. Everyone knew. By lunchtime the entire hospital would know. "I need to escort you to HR," Torres said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "Rebecca Walsh needs to see you. Right now." The walk took 90 seconds. Megan kept her hands visible, her breathing steady, her face a mask of complete composure. She'd been escorted by armed soldiers through hostile territory. She'd been questioned by people whose job was to break you. She'd walked into rooms where the only correct answer was to walk back out alive. A hospital hallway at noon on an ordinary Tuesday was nothing. It was less than nothing. Rebecca Walsh's office was on the 2nd floor, and through the window as Megan passed, she could see Dr. Sterling standing at his own window across the parking lot, arms crossed, watching her walk toward the elevator. He was smiling. It was the smile of someone who'd just won something, who'd just proven something, who'd just reminded himself that power belonged to people like him, people with networks, people with years, people with the institutional machinery that made it possible to erase someone as completely as if they'd never existed at all. The meeting lasted 47 minutes. Rebecca Walsh read the termination papers with a neutral expression of someone reading a recipe. Protocol violations. Unauthorized medical intervention. Insubordination. Dangerous judgment. A full list of sins that sounded, when she said them aloud in that sterile office, like the complete portrait of a reckless, unstable, incompetent person. Megan signed everything they put in front of her. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply signed, her hand steady, her eyes forward, understanding that this was stage 5, active sabotage, the point at which the villain stops pretending to be reasonable and simply starts destroying. Security escorted her to her car at 12:15 p.m. with a cardboard box containing her personal items, a photo of Tom, a half-read paperback, a single-shift report she'd been writing. She sat in the driver's seat for 11 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, before she started the engine. The rain had started again by then, the same rain that had been falling for 3 days, the same rain that seemed to have no intention of ever stopping. The engine turned over and caught. Megan pulled out of the Oak Creek Memorial parking lot at 12:51 p.m., the cardboard box riding in the passenger seat beside her like a body. Everything she'd brought to the hospital 3 years ago fit inside it, a coffee mug from a cafe that had closed in 2019, a photograph of her and Tom at Coronado Beach, the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, pressed now against her ribs like evidence of a crime. The rain hammered the windshield. She did not cry. The wipers moved in steady rhythm, left, right, the mechanical heartbeat of someone who had learned long ago that emotion was a luxury that got people killed. Dr. Sterling had watched from his office window while security walked her out. She'd seen him there as she passed, arms crossed, one hand pressed against the glass like he was sealing a victory. His face had held the particular satisfaction of a man who had eliminated an inconvenience without ever having to understand what he'd eliminated. He would go home tonight to a house that cost more than most people made in 5 years. He would pour himself a drink that cost $40. He would tell his wife that he'd handled a compliance issue. He would sleep like a man who had won. Megan drove through Raleigh in the rain, past strip malls and gas stations and a Walgreens where she'd picked up bandages for a blister 3 weeks ago. She drove without a destination, letting muscle memory guide her. Her hands on the steering wheel were steady. Her breathing was controlled. The part of her that had survived Kandahar, that had held a field hospital together while the walls shook from artillery fire, that part was silent and waiting. By the time she reached Oakwood Cemetery, the rain had turned brutal. She parked near the section marked with a small bronze plaque and walked without an umbrella, letting the water soak through her scrubs and the thin jacket she'd thrown over them. The grave was simple. The headstone read Thomas Michael O'Brien, 1984 to 2016. No rank. No decoration. Just a name and dates that summed up nothing of the man who lay beneath the red clay. She knelt in the mud and placed her hand on the cold stone. The unit patch inside her jacket felt like a brand. "I broke cover for a patient," she said. The rain filled her mouth. She did not wipe her face. "I broke cover and lost everything. I'm sorry, Tom. I failed us both." The rain continued. Traffic sounds from the highway 3 blocks away provided a distant white noise that was almost peaceful. She stayed there for 14 minutes, then stood, turned, and walked back to her car. Her clothes dripped. The cardboard box sat in the passenger seat, patient as a dog waiting for its owner to return from work. The next morning was clear and bright, the rain finally spent. Dr. Sterling walked into Conference Room B at Oak Creek Memorial carrying a leather portfolio. He moved with the careful precision of a man conducting a surgical strike. Inside the room, 5 members of the hospital board sat in ergonomic chairs around a mahogany table. Patricia Hendricks, the board chair, had her tablet open. Behind Sterling, a projection screen waited. "I'll keep this brief," Sterling said, advancing his first slide. "Ms. O'Brien's employment represents a significant liability we can no longer tolerate." Slide 2 appeared. A timeline. Slide 3, a red-flagged incident report. Slide 4, the credentials investigator's preliminary findings, which mentioned gaps in her background, inconsistencies in her work history, employment records that seemed to begin 5 years ago with no prior references available. "The unauthorized medical procedure she performed yesterday morning," Sterling continued, "constitutes reckless endangerment and a profound breach of protocol. The pericardiocentesis was performed without attending physician authorization, without a resident present, and without proper documentation of consent." Board member James Chen leaned forward. "What was her stated justification?" "That the patient was dying," Sterling said. As if her emotional attachment to a comatose patient justified circumventing basic hospital hierarchy. Patricia Hendricks made a note. "We can't afford the liability," she said quietly. "Precisely," Sterling said. He advanced to his summary slide, slide 12. A single sentence in bold, "Recommend immediate termination for cause, with documentation protecting the hospital from wrongful termination claims." "We have sufficient documentation to defend this action," he continued. "The investigator's report provides cause. The protocol violations provide cause. The gaps in her background provide." The doors to the conference room burst inward. 2 Navy personnel in dress uniforms entered first, moving with the fluid precision of people trained to control space. Behind them came an FBI agent in a dark suit, tablet in hand. The rotor wash from the helicopter still outside had left papers scattered across the parking lot like autumn leaves finally deciding where to fall. The room went dead silent. Sterling's mouth remained partially open, the words drying on his tongue. The Navy commander, a woman with the insignia of a full bird on her shoulder, looked directly at Sterling. "This meeting is suspended. We need all records related to Megan O'Brien immediately." "On whose authority?" Sterling's voice came out thin, almost adolescent. "Department of Defense," the FBI agent said. "National security priority." He did not explain further. Explanation was not part of his job. Outside, in the hallway, word traveled like electricity through water. A mute veteran who'd been comatose for 11 months had written his first voluntary words that morning. A single sentence that made no sense to anyone but suddenly made every sense. 3 floors up, Sarah Voss sat beside her father's bed while nurses moved with unusual urgency, and Colonel Raymond Voss held a pen in trembling fingers, writing the same words again, Senior Chief. "Send Nightingale." Sarah's hands shook as she read. Her father's eyes, which had been vacant for so long, now held something like recognition. Like purpose. The rain had stopped by 8:33 a.m. when Megan's doorbell rang. She was still wearing yesterday's scrubs. She had not slept. She had not changed. She had sat in her apartment watching the rain end and the sun come up, the cardboard box from her locker sitting on her kitchen table. The unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. When she opened the door, Commander Patricia Nolan stood in the hallway in full dress whites. Behind her, 2 sailors in identical uniforms. "Senior Chief O'Brien," Commander Nolan said. It was not a question. "You need to come with us." Megan nodded once. She did not ask questions. Questions were a waste of time, and time had just become the scarcest resource available. She grabbed her jacket, the unit patch pressing against her ribs like a second heartbeat, and followed them downstairs. The drive back to Oak Creek Memorial took 12 minutes. No one spoke. Megan sat in the back of the Navy sedan, watching the city pass, and felt something in her that had been locked away for 8 years begin to move. Not panic. Not fear. Recognition. The machinery of government was grinding into motion, and she had always understood how these machines worked. They took her through the main entrance. Staff froze as she passed. A trauma surgeon she'd worked with for 2 years stared at her, then at the Navy personnel flanking her, then back at her, his expression cycling through confusion toward a terrible understanding. The elevator opened on the 3rd floor, and they took her to Conference Room B. The room was packed. Hospital administration. The entire medical board. Medical staff. Sarah Voss was there, holding a notepad. Colonel Raymond Voss's daughter, with her father's shaking handwriting visible from across the room, Senior Chief. The lead investigator, a man named Fisher with the bearing of someone who had spent his career separating truth from institutional fiction, pulled up a file on the projection screen. His hands trembled slightly. "O'Brien, Megan Patricia," he read. "Senior Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy Special Warfare." The room trembled with the weight of those words. Not Senior Medical Officer. Not Senior Nurse. Senior Chief. The rank that denoted someone who had survived wars while learning to keep secrets that could reshape geopolitics. Fisher continued. 8 classified personnel extractions. 43 combat saves. Operated a field hospital under enemy fire for 16 continuous hours in Kandahar province when her unit was cut off from command. Performed emergency surgical intervention without anesthesia support, without surgical teams, with only field equipment and muscle memory keeping her patients alive. A Navy SEAL team leader stood, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Grant, wearing dress blues that caught the fluorescent light like polished armor. 2 Navy crosses, he said, his voice cracking. Silver Star. Purple Heart with 2 clusters. Senior Chief O'Brien pulled my entire unit out of Kandahar in 2016 when command had written us off as dead. She performed 7 field surgeries in a bombed-out compound while taking enemy fire. I wouldn't be standing here without her. Dr. Sterling's face had gone the color of old paper. His hand had retreated from the table. His triumph from this morning, only 2 hours ago, had transformed into something that looked remarkably like a man watching his career calcify into history. Patricia Hendricks whispered something to the other board members. Chen was staring at his tablet as if it might contain an explanation. The FBI agent stepped forward. Senior Chief O'Brien was ordered to disappear 8 years ago after a classified operation was buried. Her military records were scrubbed. She was told never to surface. Never to contact her unit. Never to exist as anything other than a ghost. He paused. Looked directly at Dr. Sterling. The patient she saved yesterday, Colonel Raymond Voss, is the only surviving witness to a war crime we've been investigating for 7 years. His recovery, combined with the sudden presence of a nurse with Senior Chief O'Brien's skill set, triggered a national security alert. Sarah Voss was crying. "You saved him," she said to Megan. "You saved my father twice." Commander Nolan stepped forward. "Your actions yesterday," she said to Sterling, "interfered with a federal investigation and potentially endangered a protected witness." Her voice was ice. "You had every opportunity to trust her competence. You chose institutional politics instead." Sterling opened his mouth. Closed it. His legal training, his political positioning, his entire architecture of protection had become suddenly irrelevant in the presence of something larger than any hospital board, larger than any human resources policy. Larger than Dr. Sterling himself. Megan had not moved since entering the room. Her hands were steady. Her breathing unchanged. The unit patch inside her jacket lining seemed to pulse like confirmation. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Someone coughed. A radio crackled somewhere in the building with a message about a delivery arriving at loading dock 2. And Megan O'Brien, senior chief petty officer, who had kneeled in the mud at her dead husband's grave and apologized for failing him, stood in a conference room surrounded by people who were only beginning to understand that she had never failed at anything in her life. The colonel's daughter stood in the hallway outside the conference room, trembling. Her name was Sarah Voss. Her father had not spoken in 8 days. His vocal cords had been damaged by smoke inhalation in the same operation that had scarred his lungs, the same operation that had stolen his words and buried him in silence. She pushed the door open with shaking hands. The room fell quiet. Every federal agent, every officer, every person holding classified clearance turned to face her. "My father wrote one word this morning," she said, her voice fractured. "Senior Chief." Just that. On a notepad. "I didn't understand until I heard them say your name just now. I didn't understand until right now." Megan stood motionless. The unit patch beneath her jacket lining, the one she'd worn hidden against her ribs for 8 years, pressed against her heart through every 12-hour shift, every bedside vigil, every moment of pretending to be ordinary, suddenly felt visible to every person in the room, as if they could see through skin and bone and cloth straight to the proof of her identity. The lead investigator, a woman named Agent Chen with silver streaking her temples, pulled a folder from her briefcase. The folder was 6 inches thick. Her hand shook as she opened it, and Megan understood that even people accustomed to classified material had never opened a file like this one in front of the person whose life was catalogued inside it. 8 classified extractions, Chen read aloud, her voice hollow with the weight of the number. 43 combat saves. Operated a field hospital under enemy fire for 16 hours straight. Kandahar Province, 2014. The air in the room changed. Megan could taste it, a metallic charge like the aftermath of defibrillation, that ozone-sharp tang of electricity reorganizing the atoms around you. A SEAL team leader stepped forward. His nameplate read Holloway. His uniform bore 3 deployments worth of hash marks on his sleeve. He was older than Megan by maybe 5 years, and his eyes held the particular clarity of men who had been dead and walked back from it. He spoke with the precision of someone delivering a formal report. 2 Navy crosses, he said. Each word landed like a boot heel on tile. A silver star. 2 purple hearts. She pulled my entire unit out of Kandahar when command wrote us off as dead. 8 of us who should be in Arlington instead are sitting at home with our families because of her. The silence that followed wasn't the quiet of respect. It was the silence of people reordering their entire understanding of reality, of suddenly seeing the woman in the scrubs as something they had been trained to recognize but had never expected to encounter in a civilian hospital. It was the silence of power shifting direction, like a gun barrel turning in slow motion to point at a new target. An FBI agent stepped forward. His suit was charcoal gray. His badge caught the fluorescent light like a mirror. "The patient she saved is Colonel Raymond Voss. Retired. And he is the only living witness to a war crime we have been investigating for 7 years. His sudden recovery and her presence in his medical file triggered a national security alert at 0600 hours this morning." When he wrote that word, Senior Chief, the entire picture clarified. She was there. When the contractors opened fire. When 18 soldiers, including Chief Petty Officer Thomas O'Brien, were killed in a location that was officially never there. Megan's throat tightened. The agent had said her husband's name in front of federal agents and Navy commanders and a room full of people who were now understanding that every moment of her 8-year silence had been purchased with her husband's grave. The door to the conference room opened. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway. His face was the color of concrete. His hands were empty. He had come to present his termination case, 6 months of evidence, 3 phone calls to board members, an outside investigator, a carefully assembled narrative about resource misallocation and insubordination. The FBI agent did not turn around. "Dr. Sterling, you are being placed on administrative leave pending review of your medical decision-making related to patient Voss. You are instructed not to contact hospital staff or patients. Your hospital privileges are suspended effective immediately. You may leave the building now." Sterling's lips moved. Nothing came out. He looked at Megan. She did not look back. The same security guard who had escorted her out of Oak Creek Memorial yesterday, his name was Torres, and he had seemed genuinely sorry as he handed her the cardboard box, appeared in the hallway behind Sterling. Torres was holding an identical cardboard box. Plain brown cardboard. Exactly the same size. Torres walked into the conference room and stood in Sterling's office doorway. "I believe you know the way out, sir," he said quietly. Sterling's hand reached for the doorframe. The hand was shaking. He looked like a man who had stepped onto thin ice and heard it crack beneath his weight, the shock of knowing he had miscalculated everything, and the water was coming up fast. He walked out. Torres followed, the cardboard box in his hands like a pallbearer's standard. The room breathed. 6 months later, Megan walked down Fayetteville Street in downtown Raleigh wearing jeans and a navy hoodie, the kind of civilian invisibility she had perfected across 2,000 days. The air was autumn sharp. Leaves scattered across the sidewalk in rust and gold. She passed a strip mall anchored by a grocery store. The businesses were struggling: empty storefront, a tax preparation office, a cell phone repair shop with its lights dimmed. A folding table sat outside one unit beneath a faded umbrella. Dr. Sterling sat behind that table. He wore a suit that had cost maybe $300. Business cards were spread in front of him like playing cards. His eyes had the hollowed-out look of a man who had lost not just a job but the narrative he had built his entire life around. His jaw was softer. His shoulders curved inward like he was trying to make himself smaller. Insurance policies. He was selling insurance policies. Megan saw him. He saw her. For exactly 1 second, their eyes met across 20 feet of weathered pavement. He looked away first. His face flushed. He bent over the business cards, suddenly very interested in their arrangement. Megan kept walking. A Navy staff car waited in Oak Creek Memorial's parking lot. The driver was a yeoman named Martinez. Megan climbed into the back seat and changed into dress uniform, the service dress blues that had been packed away since 2016. The jacket bore ribbons in ascending order, the medal she had earned in places the Pentagon would never acknowledge. The unit patch was sewn onto her shoulder, visible to the world. The faded patch that had lived against her ribs, that had stayed with her through every shift, every insult, every moment of hiding. It was on the outside now. Finally on the outside. Martinez drove her to the airfield in silence. A military transport waited, AC-17 transport with its ramp down. The engines were already hot. The rotor wash made the ground press up against your bones. The flight to Walter Reed took 2 hours and 14 minutes. The ceremony was held in the hospital's main auditorium. 37 people attended: active duty commanders, retired special forces, combat medics from 3 different units. Colonel Raymond Voss sat in the front row. He walked there on his own. The medical team had estimated for more months of therapy before independent ambulation. He had accomplished it in 6 weeks. His daughter Sarah sat beside him with her hand on his arm. The commanding officer who presented Megan's commendation was a Rear Admiral named Foster. His voice carried the weight of classified operations, of knowing exactly who Megan had been and what she had done when the world needed her to be invisible. For extraordinary service to a witness under federal protection, resulting in the recovery and testimony that led to the conviction of 3 contractors responsible for the massacre of 18 service members. For maintaining her oath in circumstances that demanded both her presence and her absence. For choosing to save a patient when she had every reason to walk away. Voss stood. He saluted her. Megan returned the salute. Her eyes held. After the ceremony, walking the halls of Walter Reed, Megan saw a familiar face. Dr. Ramos, the former combat medic who had recognized her technique 6 months ago at Oak Creek Memorial. He was wearing a white coat with a Walter Reed Medical Center badge. "They're offering you a position here," he said. "Full clinical authority. Nurse practitioner track. You considering it?" Megan looked out the window at the flag flying above the medical center. The flag was moving in a wind she could feel even through the glass, alive, present, impossible to ignore. "I spent 8 years hiding who I was," she said. Her voice was different now. Deeper. Carrying weight like a soldier's pack. "I'm done hiding." Ramos nodded. "Then we'll put your name on the door. The real one." Megan turned to face him, and something in her eyes made him understand that the timid nurse from Oak Creek Memorial was not hiding anymore. She was visible. She was here. She was never leaving. "You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior," she said quietly. "You just need to show up when everyone else walks away." The hallway stretched in both directions. Nurses passed. Doctors moved between patient rooms. The hospital breathed and functioned and healed, and somewhere in that machinery of care, Megan O'Brien, Senior Chief Petty Officer, Nightingale, the woman who had saved the witness who brought justice to the fallen, walked in uniform, visible at last, finally home. If this story reached you, if you watched until the end, you already know the truth. The ones who stay are the ones who matter. The ones who see you, really see you, when the rest of the world is looking away. If Megan O'Brien's choice to save one patient resonated with you, please subscribe, like this video, and comment below. Tell us, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you really were?